Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, right at the start, we have our usual issue, which is we're recording this on a Monday morning. The listeners will hear it tomorrow. So by then, we'll know whether or not we've had a meaningful vote today, Monday. Are you expecting to have one?
Whether there will be a meaningful vote today or not is in the hands of the Speaker, and predicting what the Speaker will do is not as easy as historically it has been, that conventions seem to come and go as the leaves fall off the trees. What the government wants is a clear decision by the House of Commons. Does the House of Commons approve the deal, or does it reject the deal? What we don't want is have another event like Saturday, where at the end of proceedings you're no clear as to whether the House has approved or rejected the deal. So it needs to be a straight vote, but we are in the hands of Mr. Speaker.
Just for the point of view of the listeners, why do you need this meaningful vote at all? Why not just go straight to the bill tomorrow?
Well, that is an option, but the Withdrawal Act does require a meaningful vote. Now, it's obviously possible to wrap that up into the Act itself, and therefore that would obviate the need for a vote, but it would be preferable, I think, to follow the existing Act.
You want to show there's a majority in the Commons for this deal, which you didn't get a chance to do on Saturday because of the Letwin amendment, yes?
That's right. The Letwin amendment meant that Saturday might just as well not have happened. It meant that the House of Commons came along and didn't decide anything at all. It didn't decide whether it liked the deal or it didn't like the deal. It just was worried about the Ben Act and wanting confusion and delay. So Saturday was not the House of Commons' finest hour. The Commons needs to come to a decision. Does it want to leave with a deal, or does it want to leave without a deal? Or are the people who say they don't want to leave without a deal actually not being quite straight, and in reality they don't want to leave at all, and they are using obstruction, delay, parliamentary tactics, procedural motions to try and achieve their bigger aim, which is of frustrating the vote of 17.4 million people.
Where do you think Oliver Letwin fits into that scale, by the way?
It's very difficult to know. It's sometimes with a person of that level of intelligence, difficult to follow the complexities of his argument. So you'd better ask him and see if he can explain it in a way that is readily understandable.
He would say, or he has said, he simply wanted to give more time to the consideration of the bill.
Everything he's done has been to frustrate leaving altogether. His words say one thing, his actions point in a different direction. That's why I say a man of his intelligence is sometimes more confusing than elucidating.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Are you expecting to win a meaningful vote if it happened? I mean, after all, just coming back to Mr. Letwin for a moment, he said he'd vote with you on a meaningful vote if there's a straight-up vote.
Well, he then prevented there being such a vote. So,
well, you better put that to him, as you'd say to
yes,
me.
Indeed. So, but I'm quoting him doesn't necessarily get either of us very much further. In any direction, it gets us going around in circles, and perhaps that's what happens if you're very, very clever, that you find you whirl around in a gigantic circle. The government wants to have the meaningful vote because it would like people to show that they accept this remarkable success of the Prime Minister, that everyone said he couldn't get a deal. He got a deal in 85 days, and he got a deal that will take us out of the customs union, out of the single market, make us able to do free trade deals, able to make our laws, stop making contributions to the European Union, is Brexit in every sense. And people said he couldn't possibly do it. It really is a terrific success.
Where do you think you are in getting Labour MPs to come across to vote for this? Because you got fewer on Saturday than you might have expected. You might have hoped for about 15, you got about 5. I mean, surely they won't come until or unless they think you're going to win.
Well, I think the issue really is that on a procedural motion, it's much harder to persuade people to break their whip on a procedural motion, because procedural motions don't seem to be so important. They can have the same effect as the main motion, but it's harder to break the whip on seemingly a little thing, on seemingly a big thing. So
you're hoping for...
Time will tell.
You're
yes.
hoping for more, and you'd expect most of the 21 Conservative MPs who lost the whip to vote with you, wouldn't you?
Well, it's very interesting. Even Kenneth Clarke, perhaps the most distinguished member of the 21, considering the offices he's held, and the high esteem in which he is still held within the Conservative Party, in spite of disagreements on Brexit, he said he would back a deal at this stage.
Could you lose the programme motion?
Well, if you think back to the House of Lords reform, the government won the vote on second reading, but came to the conclusion that the rebellion against it was so great that it wouldn't win the programme motion. I think, but I can't be certain about this, that anyone who votes for the bill will vote for the programme, because the whole point of voting for the bill will be saying we need to get this done and done now and out of the way. But I can't be sure of that.
Because I could quite easily imagine Oliver Letwin voting for the bill but not the programme. I'm sorry, I shouldn't mention Oliver Letwin again. We've been determined not to. But if by any chance the programme motion fell, then you might as well have an extension, might you not? Because the debate will roll on and on and on into the Greek kalends.
I think you should have a Letwin cast, I think, a legast, I think it might be called, because there are so many questions that only he can answer. I think Parliament has to deal with this issue. The deadline didn't come out of the ether. It's set by a combination of Article 50 and by law passed by Parliament. So Parliament then saying, oh, this deadline's unreasonable, is absurd. It's a deadline Parliament itself bought into. So both by passing the Article 50 Act, which had an overwhelming majority, but also the terms of the Withdrawal Act, which set exit date, as amended. So I think asking for more time is pointless and foolish. And no, we should not ask for an extension. We should leave on the 31st with or without a deal.
Are you hoping that the EU refuses an extension? Because after all, one way of thinking about what's happened is the EU and the government is now, as it were, on the same side. I mean, you've been at loggerheads in the negotiation, but a deal has been agreed. Everyone wants the deal to go through. So therefore, a logical thing for the EU to do would be to turn around to Parliament and say, enough of all this, we're going to veto an extension.
Well, that's what's been intimated, both by the President of the Commission and by the President of France. So if that is the EU's position, even the supporters of the Ben Act have accepted that they can't legislate for what the European Union does.
You'd welcome that, would you?
Well,
well,
they haven't got to that point yet because they haven't convened the council that would decide this, and it's not really for me to say what the European Union should do. But I don't think that an extension serves anybody's purposes at all, particularly as the Prime Minister said he's not going to negotiate anything further. This is it. This is done.
Are we going to leave on October 31st?
Yes.
And when was the occasion, it must be within the last 2 or 3 years, you went to address a meeting of the DUP in Northern Ireland?
I think it was January of this year, the very end of January.
Where did you go?
I went to Antrim.
How many times have you been to sort of speak, as it were, for the DUP or at DUP
That's the only
meetings?
that's the only time I've spoken to the DUP.
That's the only time you've been.
Yes.
But it is the case that ministers and backbenchers have been across to their meetings, and that Boris Johnson went to their conference and said that no Conservative Prime Minister could tolerate borders in the Irish Sea, but we have them.
No, we don't.
Because?
There's no border in the Irish Sea, or as Anna Soubry said, in the North Sea. There may be a border in the North Sea, but not very usefully with Ireland. The issue isn't a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There is not a border. Northern Ireland will be in the same customs union as the United Kingdom. The question is goods that may be going on to the Republic of Ireland. And if goods are going on to the Republic of Ireland, they will have to make declarations and maybe subject to checks. But if they're ending up in Northern Ireland, no checks, no rules, no tariffs, nothing.
And why won't the DUP accept that?
Well, the DUP are concerned about the consent issue. I think they're much, as far as I can tell, they are much more concerned about the consent issue than they are about the customs arrangement, because I hope they have been reassured that they are in the same customs arrangement as the whole of the United Kingdom. There's no separation. And it's interesting, the amendment to the Customs Act that was passed that said there must be no difference between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, when that was taken to court, didn't get anywhere at all. So you could read into that, if you wanted to, that the courts have accepted that there is no difference. So that may be reading too much into it, and you'll have to get lawyers on to discuss these legal niceties. So I think they're concerned about the issue of consent, and they feel that the consent should be the dual lock that applies instalment rather than a simple majority. The government's response to this is actually a decision of the United Kingdom. It's not a devolved decision. It is a United Kingdom decision that has a particular arrangement for Northern Ireland, rather than a devolved decision where Northern Ireland is leading the decision making.
Simple fact in political terms is they want to be able to block it themselves if they feel they're in a situation that they don't like, and are presumably unhappy about having to have cross-community consent because it wouldn't give them a veto.
Well, I think, again, the issue there is that the arrangements are intended to be temporary, and that there are requirements for the UK and the EU to come to a permanent solution, and that there is a shorter time period for renewal if it doesn't have cross-community consent. So, the special arrangements for Northern Ireland last for 4 years. At the end of 4 years, there's meant to be a vote at Stormont to determine whether it will last for a longer period. If that is done by a simple majority, it will last for a further 4 years. If it's done with cross-community consent, it will last for 8 years. So there is a benefit of cross-community consent. There is an element of tying in on that, but there is also a specific requirement for the two governments to push towards an agreement that replaces it.
As the leader of the House, you will have lots of conversations with different people about how they're going to vote. Do you think they came close to abstaining on Saturday?
No, that's much more the Chief Whip than me, actually. I mean, I have friendly conversations with people, but I'm not doing the whipping job of, you know how it is when you're canvassing, and you've got somebody saying, don't know, or haven't decided, and you then ask the next question, well, how did you vote last time? And when they say, well, I've always voted Labour, you know that their don't know means that they're still going to be voting Labour. That's not the role that I'm fulfilling in the Commons.
Of course, you're hopeful they might abstain or come round to the deal altogether.
I hope that the deal will prove so popular that it doesn't even need a division, that everything will go through by acclaim.
Isn't the biggest difficulty that back in the Theresa May era, there was always all this talk of the Commons having a vote on the customs union, and it kind of never quite materialised. But if you were the Labour Party, the obvious thing to try to do is you've got this deal here that puts the whole UK into one customs arrangement outside the customs union. The obvious thing to do is to try to have a vote to put the UK in the customs union and hope you can get some dissident Conservatives across and the rest of the Commons on side, and hey-ho, you've torpedoed the bill.
Why have you torpedoed the bill?
Because you've added the customs union on into the bill.
How do you add the customs union?
An amendment.
But how does that add the customs union?
Surely you can have a form of words that says this is what the House of Commons wants, that's then in the bill, goes into the Act, that contravenes what's been agreed in the legislation.
If it contravenes what's in the legislation, we haven't ratified the deal, and then we leave without a deal. If, however, it is a wish list by the House of Commons to say we would like to be in the customs union, what does that do? We can't put ourselves in a customs union with the European Union unless the European Union agrees. To get into that position, we have to negotiate it. Which government is going to negotiate our application to the customs union? This is part of the political declaration, the continuing relationship, and that is a two-way negotiation. It's not simply Parliament saying this is what will happen. But the other thing is that if we were to be in the customs union, we would be, at least as far as trade is concerned, the vassal state, because all our trade policy would be determined by the EU and we'd have no say over it. People who advocate the customs union seem to forget the key point that we're leaving the European Union, and the customs union is the cornerstone of the European Union, was where it started. And so it's a sleight of hand to try and pretend we're staying in when we're not.
You've just said they could potentially wreck the bill by putting a customs union amendment in and getting it through. And you then said, well, in that case, we'd have no deal.
That's right.
You very specifically said so. So that's actually your swords of Damocles you're trying to dangle over their heads, which is you do this, and it'll be Brexit with no deal, which is the very thing you're saying you oppose.
I don't know that there are any horsehairs around at the moment, but the issue is exactly the same as the 1972 European Communities Act. In an act that is ratifying a treaty and giving it domestic legal effect, amendments are fatal to the ratification, and therefore you haven't ratified.
It's a very long time since the Commons put through an amendment in breach of a treaty, I'm told. I don't know the date.
I don't know the date either. But you are entitled to withdraw from treaties, but it makes no sense to ratify a treaty in a way that doesn't ratify it, because then you don't have an international agreement in the first place.
Just sitting and reflecting on this conversation, I mean, a fortnight ago, no MP I know of, no commentator, no one expected there to be a deal which the DUP would oppose, but would be reached with the European Union. So what actually happened last week? I mean, it started off with reports of this quite bristly conversation between the Prime Minister and Angela Merkel. Someone in language remarkably similar to the kind of language used by Dominic Cummings briefs James Forsyth at The Spectator that there's going to be no deal and all sorts of terrible things will happen. By the end of the week, we're on our way to a deal. How did it come about?
Well, because the Prime Minister is a man of his word. The Prime Minister said he wanted a deal. Speak to Hugh Merriman, who backed the government over the Benn Amendment, because the Prime Minister promised him that he was going to work as hard as possible to get a deal. And the Prime Minister delivered. Now, lots of people who voted for the Benn Act didn't believe the Prime Minister. They thought this was just folderol. And in fact, it wasn't. It was truth. And the achievement of the Prime Minister is enormous. I'll tell you, I've said this in other forums, but I haven't said it at Conservative Home. I went out Sunday a week ago to defend the deal that had been done without knowing what was in it. And I did this purely on the basis of trust, that I was sufficiently confident that the Prime Minister would not have agreed something that I couldn't live with. And that trust was completely justified when I discovered the details of the deal. It is such a triumph that all the Eurosceptics in the House of Commons, whole of the ERG, I think without exception, have come around to supporting it. That is a really remarkable achievement in such a short space of time. And it shows that we can trust the Prime Minister to do what he said, but to do it properly.
I mean, he obviously can't do this on his own. So something happened between him and Leo Varadkar. It was that meeting that started the ball rolling, and Varadkar came bouncing out and, gave a statement and said that he thought there was a pathway to a deal. So what do you think happened on the Irish side to change the situation and come to this accommodation so quickly?
I don't know. I'm not sufficiently expert on the workings of the Irish government's internal policy making to be able to tell you. Sometimes, however, goodwill goes a very long way in negotiations, and personal relationships are more important than you might expect them to be. And it may just be that the two ministers got on well and realised that they could do business together, like Margaret Thatcher and Mikhail Gorbachev.
What I think you might be saying is that because Boris Johnson's got this extrovert projection, he was able somehow to hit it off with Leo Varadkar, where his predecessor failed to do it.
Well, and vice versa, that Varadkar is quite a charismatic figure, and you have the two of them coming together, and it may be as simple as that, and they found that they could trust each other and they could do a deal.
Do you feel Northern Ireland needs any reassurance about the Union in the aftermath of what's happened? Because you've set out what the customs arrangements are and you've set out what the regulatory arrangements are. But to them, it doesn't necessarily look like that. And someone over the weekend wrote, this looks like the Anglo-Irish Agreement Mark II in a kind of economic form. And the Anglo-Irish Agreement, as you know, it was followed by a very long process of something that we used to call loyalist alienation in the 1990s that caused very, very big problems. Is there anything there like that now, do you think? And does anything need to be done about strengthening the union?
I think it's always important to strengthen the union. The one thing I think that will strengthen it the most is actually leaving the European Union, which will help reassure people as to what its advantages are, that the economic prospects of the UK outside the European Union without European controls and misguided economic policy will be very, very helpful, and that will make people see a way to prosperity outside the European Union that will show the purpose of the United Kingdom Union. But to your broader point, yes, of course, it is very important that English politicians emphasise why the union matters, because it is easy, in English terms, to take it for granted as the largest country by population within the union. And so I'm sure that is happening, and I know that the Prime Minister is personally a very committed unionist, made himself Minister for the Union.
Do you think the party's done enough over the years to explicitly say we are a pro-union party, rather than sometimes in Northern Ireland presenting itself as a kind of keeper of the rules?
The Conservative Party is a pro-union party. I mean, you had a very interesting piece on this morning, and how the Conservative Party operates within the union, and that we even have Conservative candidates standing. And I think you're onto something that is important. We are sympathetic to the DUP, but we are not in fact the same party as the DUP. And there are therefore sometimes differences in how we approach things. Now, that doesn't undermine the key point that the biggest issue that combines us is the union, which is of fundamental importance, but we then have some other different policy precepts.
So, for example, making Trinity's very point about leaving the European Union and economic policy and so on, for example, one could revive the old idea of slashing corporation tax back in Northern Ireland, could one not?
It's a very interesting idea. I'd better not trespass on the Chancellor's territory, but that is a very interesting idea.
You've never expressed a view on it before, as far as you can know.
Have I not? I've expressed views on so many
I'm
things.
just wondering.
I've normally expressed views on everything you can think of, which sometimes come back to bite me. But I'm trying desperately to think whether I have said anything before that I could point you in the direction of, but I can't remember any formal thing that I've said.
Look. I mean, just finally, to come back to this business of the possibility of an amendment that wrecks the bill. I mean, in that case, the Prime Minister would presumably turn around for a third time and say, this cannot go on, we must have a general election.
Well, a general election must be the obvious answer, that we have a Parliament that can't get its business done. It won't go in any direction. It's not that it wants to go against the direction of the government, it just won't decide which way it wants to go at all. It won't say yes, it won't say no. And we can't operate.
But you say you can't. It's possible to imagine, isn't it, that the bill is voted down, a second referendum is voted down because there doesn't seem to be a majority for it in the Commons. Boris Johnson proposes an election, and the Commons won't budge because, as you say, they don't want to do anything. They don't want to lose their seats. They don't want to have to face the voters. And they sit there like, in what we called on Conhome the equivalent of the welfare scroungers of tabloid legend, just drawing their salaries but not doing very much.
But the indicative votes showed that the House of Commons didn't agree on anything. There was no majority for any specific policy. And the Fixed Term Parliament Act means that, yes, the House of Commons could go on forever. Ultimately, this must clear, mustn't it? Because if a budget weren't to be passed and there were to be no Finance Act, then we stop collecting income tax. Now, this has to be done, admittedly, by August of next year, so there's quite a long time horizon. But a lot of Conhome readers might not be too upset if there weren't any income tax, but it would make running the country a little bit tricky.
Might not even be upset if there was no government, but having no government is ultimately a bit of a problem. Well,
it is a bit of a problem, and this is a serious problem. And the Fixed Term Parliament Act was always a mistake because it doesn't go with the grain of our constitutional system. That people forget that the government is in Parliament, the government is part of Parliament, and therefore you can't have executive, Parliament and judiciary. You have the executive as Parliament. And yes, you have a difference between the executive and the legislative functions within Parliament, but nonetheless they are within that whole circle that is Parliament. And so if the government cannot get its business, then you need a new government and a new Parliament.
Just on that very point, sorry, it occurred to me to say something about the Boris Johnson, the 2 letters. Hasn't it proved the nonsense of this measure to try to direct the executive into what to do, in that the legislature can't be the executive. It can't know everything that's going to happen in a negotiation. Above all, it can't control what a Prime Minister thinks and what he says. So if he sends a second letter, he's surely going to be very unlikely to end up in court. I've not read of any proceedings this morning. I'm not quite sure what the legal remedy would be.
Well, the absolute issue here is that Parliament cannot do the detailed work by legislation that a government needs to do by executive power. And therefore the Benn Act was a ridiculous act. It just said this letter had to be sent. But the Prime Minister said he doesn't want an extension. He won't involve himself in any negotiations after the deadline. And Parliament has a remedy. It has a remedy that it won't use, which is a vote of confidence in the government. And as Leader of the House, I've kept on saying that if any party, minor party, major party, wants a vote of confidence, time will be provided for it. But they won't do that, and therefore they won't do anything. And that is the real problem with this Parliament, is its complete inability to make up its mind. It doesn't know whether it wants to support the government or oppose the government. It doesn't know whether it wants to pass a meaningful vote or oppose a meaningful vote. So it is confusion and delay. It would upset the Fat Controller very greatly for your listeners who are expert in Thomas the Tank Engine.
And as one has to be. Well, we'll be back in a fortnight. We'll see if this Parliament has got anywhere, or if it's still going round and round in circles in this Letwin-esque way that you describe. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much.
Thank you, as always.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.